Hello, my dear children. Myself Sujata. Hope you're all doing well. In the last session, we learned how France abolished monarchy and became a republic, and how the laws introduced by the revolutionary government helped to improve the lives of women in France. Have you revised the previous portions clearly and completed the assignments given? Okay, in today's session, we are going to learn about one of the most revolutionary social reforms of the Jacobin regime. One of the most revolutionary social reforms of the Jacobin regime was the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. The colonies in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and San Domingo were important suppliers of commodities such as tobacco, indigo, sugar, and coffee. But the Europeans were reluctant to go and work in distant and unfamiliar land. This resulted in a shortage of labor on the plantations. This was met by a triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The slave trade began in the 17th century. French merchants sailed from the ports of Bordeaux or Nantes to the African coast, where they bought slaves from local chieftains. These slaves were packed tightly into ships for the 3-month long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. And they were sold to plantation owners. The exploitation of slave labor made it possible to meet the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee, and indigo. Indigo is a blue dye obtained from indigo plants. Port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes became prosperous with the help of this slave trade. The National Assembly held long debates about whether the rights of man should be extended to all French subjects, including those in the colonies. But it did not pass any laws. Fearing opposition from businessmen whose incomes depended mainly on this slave trade. Finally, the convention, that is the newly formed assembly, which in 1794 legislated to free all slaves in the French overseas possessions. This, however, turned out to be a short term measure, as 10 years later, Napoleon reintroduced slavery. Slavery was finally abolished in French colonies in the year 1848. Now, let me ask you one question. Can politics change the clothes people wear, the language they speak, or the books they read? The years following 1789 in France saw many such changes in the lives of men, women, and children. The revolutionary governments took it upon themselves to pass laws that would translate the ideals of liberty and equality into everyday practices. So let us understand the revolution in everyday life. One important law that came into effect soon after the storming of the Bastille in the summer of 1789 was the abolition of censorship. In the old regime, all written material and cultural activities like books, newspapers, plays could be published or performed only after they had been approved by the censors of the king. Now, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. Newspapers, pamphlets, books, and printed pictures flooded the towns of France from where they traveled rapidly into the countryside. They all described and discussed the events and changes taking place in France. Freedom of the press also meant that opposing views of events could be expressed. Each side sought to convince the others of its position through the medium of print. Plays, songs, and festive processions attracted large numbers of people. This was one way they could grasp and identify with ideas such as liberty or justice that political philosophers wrote about at length in texts which only a handful of educated people could read. Even though after Robespierre's rule, a directory was formed to avoid concentration of power in one individual, in the year 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France. He conquered neighboring European countries, dispossessed dynasties, and created kingdoms where he placed members of his family. Napoleon saw his role as a modernizer of Europe. He introduced many laws such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. Many saw Napoleon as a liberator who would bring freedom for the people. But Napoleon came to be viewed everywhere as an invading force. He was finally defeated at Waterloo in the year 1815. Let us understand the important legacy of the French Revolution. Legacy means that we inherit from our ancestors. The ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution. These spread from France to the rest of Europe during the 19th century, where feudal systems were abolished. Colonized people reworked the idea of freedom from bondage into their movements to create a sovereign nation state. Tipu Sultan and Ram Mohan Roy are two examples of individuals who responded to the ideas coming from revolutionary France. Before concluding, let us have a quick glance at the timeline of French Revolution. As you know, in the year 1774, Louis XVI of the Bourbon family of kings ascended the throne of France. Upon his accession, he found an empty treasury. Long years of war had drained the financial resources of France. To meet regular expenses, the state was forced to increase taxes. As you know, the third estate had to bore with all the taxes like tithe and tithe. On 5th May 1789, Louis XVI called together an assembly of the States General to pass proposals for new taxes. In the past, each estate had one vote. Third estate demanded that voting now be conducted by the assembly as a whole, where each member would have one vote. As you know, that was one of the democratic principles put forward by the philosopher like Rousseau. King rejected and Third Estate walked out of the assembly. On 20th June 1789, they assembled in the hall of an indoor tennis court in the grounds of Versailles and declared themselves a national assembly, and we know that it was one of the historic events that happened during the French Revolution. And they swore not to disperse until they had drafted a constitution that would limit the power of the monarch. While National Assembly was busy drafting a constitution, the rest of the France were in turmoil, and on 14th July 1789, the agitated crowd stormed and destroyed the Bastille. Faced with the power of his revolting subjects, Louis XVI finally accorded recognition to the National Assembly, and on the night of 4th August 1789, the Assembly passed a decree abolishing the feudal system of obligations and taxes. On 26 August 1789, rights of men were declared, and 1791, the National Assembly completed the draft of the Constitution which limits the power of the king. On April 1792, the National Assembly voted to declare war against Prussia and Austria. On 21st September 1792, the convention, that is the newly elected assembly, abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. On 21st January 1793, Louis XVI was executed publicly at the Plaza de la Concorde. The period from 1793 to 1794 is called as the Reign of Terror under the leadership of Robespierre. July 1794, Robespierre was arrested and beheaded. 1794, the convention freed all slaves in the French overseas possessions. In the year 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France. In 1815, Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. Slavery was finally abolished in French colonies during the year 1848, and 1946, women in France won the right to vote. With this, we have come to end of the chapter. Hope you have understood. Go through the slides again and again. Read the chapter thoroughly. Make every events in the French Revolution clear. Meet you in the next session. Thank you.